Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail as the pre-dawn darkness shrouded the Pacific waters. Around Midway atoll, the formation of for fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, hear you, and Soryu cut through the swells with deadly precision, their decks bristling with aircraft that would soon rain destruction upon the American stronghold. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy commanded the Pacific like an ancient sea god, and today would cement their dominance forever. The plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's masterpiece, a coordinated assault that would draw out the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet and destroy them in decisive battle. Intelligence suggested the Americans possessed only 2 or 3 carriers in the entire Pacific, hardly a match for the combined fleet's overwhelming superiority. Nagumo's first carrier striking force alone fielded more naval aviation power than most nations possessed in their entire military. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, the deck crews began their deadly choreography. Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3 Valdiv bombers were spotted on the flight decks, their engines warming with metallic growls that echoed across the water. Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters provided escort, their sleek forms embodying Japanese engineering excellence. The sight filled every sailor with pride. This was the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force that had humbled Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific. Like a tsunami of steel and fire, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, briefed his aircrews in the ready room of the Akagi. Maps of Midway covered the bulkheads, showing the tiny atoll's strategic position as America's westernmost outpost. "Today we complete what we began 6 months ago," he declared, his voice carrying the confidence of a warrior who had never known defeat. "The American eagle will fall beneath the rising sun." According to historical accounts detailed in Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, Japanese confidence remained absolute. Despite growing American cryptographic capabilities, the morning attack wave launched at 4:30, 108 aircraft disappearing into the dawn sky toward Midway. Nagumo watched them go with satisfaction, already planning the follow-up strikes that would prepare the atoll for Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force. By nightfall, the rising sun would fly over American soil for the first time since 1812. But 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Chester Nimitz's trap was already closing. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes, and 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, lay in wait beyond the horizon. What the Japanese believed would be their greatest triumph was about to become their most catastrophic defeat. The stage was set for the battle that would turn the tide of the Pacific War, though Admiral Nagumo could not yet know that his perfectly ordered formations were sailing toward disaster. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped the controls of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber as Enterprise's flight deck fell away. Beneath him, round him, 33 more Dauntless aircraft climbed into the morning sky, their crews knowing they flew toward the most important mission in American naval history. The intelligence was clear, for Japanese carriers operated somewhere northwest of Midway, and finding them meant the difference between victory and annihilation. Admiral Raymond Spruance had launched every operational aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet. The gamble was enormous. If they missed the Japanese fleet, their carriers would be defenseless against counterattack. But the alternative was allowing Nagumo's veterans to operate unopposed, and that meant certain defeat. The American plan was desperately simple: find the enemy carriers and destroy them before they could launch a coordinated strike. The morning sun climbed higher as McCluskey's squadron flew northwest, searching the vast expanse of blue for telltale wakes and masts below them. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was already beginning its doomed attack run. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron had found the Japanese fleet first, but his obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were flying into a hornet's nest without fighter escort. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol descended on Waldron's squadron like avenging angels. Mitsubishi Zeros, piloted by veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, tore through the lumbering American torpedo bombers with ruthless efficiency. One by one, the devastators fell into the sea, their crews vanishing beneath the waves. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket as he watched the slaughter of his squadron mates. But Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice was not in vain. The low-altitude attack had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the sky above clear for McCluskey's dive bombers. As the Zeros climbed desperately to regain altitude, 37 dauntless aircraft from Enterprise appeared, overhead like thunderbolts from Olympus. Admiral Nagumo faced his moment of greatest crisis aboard Akagi. His flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed for a second strike on Midway. Bombs and torpedoes scattered across the hangar, decks in organized chaos. The first wave had returned with reports of successful attacks, but recommended another strike to complete Midway's destruction. Yet radio intercepts suggested American surface ships nearby, possibly including carriers. The decision to rearm for anti-ship attack had just been made when lookouts screamed warnings from the bridge wings. High above, American dive bombers were rolling into their attacks, the sun glinting off their wings as they plummeted toward the Japanese carriers. With mathematical precision, McCluskey selected Kaga as his target, pushing his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive as anti-aircraft fire blossomed around him like deadly flowers. The carrier grew larger in his bomb sight, her deck packed with aircraft and ordnance. At 1,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of the dive. His aircraft shuddering under the G-forces, the bomb struck Kaga near her island's superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft below. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited, turning the pride of the Imperial Navy into a floating inferno. Within minutes, similar hits struck Akagi and Soryu, their flight decks erupting in geysers of flame and twisted metal. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers were burning, wrecks, their aircraft and crews consumed by fires that would rage for hours. The perfectly ordered formations that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months were crumbling beneath Midway's overwhelming assault. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on the bridge of the burning carrier Soryu, flames licking at the windows as his ship transformed into a steel funeral pyre. Round him, his officers pleaded for evacuation orders, but the veteran naval officer remained motionless, watching his command die beneath American bombs. The carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor now listed heavily to starboard, her flight deck a twisted landscape of shattered aircraft and spreading fires. The mathematical precision of the American dive bomber attack had achieved what 6 months of Japanese dominance made unthinkable: the simultaneous destruction of 3 fleet carriers in 5 minutes. Akagi burned fiercely to the north, Admiral Nagumo and his staff forced to transfer to the light cruiser Nagara. As their flagship became uninhabitable, Kaga wallowed dead in the water, her magazines cooking off in spectacular explosions that sent aircraft parts and human remains cascading into the Pacific. But one Japanese carrier remained operational, Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi. While his sister ships burned, Yamaguchi launched every available aircraft in a desperate counterattack. 18 Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers and 6 Nakajima B-5 Nkate torpedo bombers climbed into the afternoon sky, escorted by Mitsubishi Zeros flown by some of Japan's most experienced pilots. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the dive bombers toward the American task force, his crew knowing they flew a one-way mission. Intelligence indicated 3 American carriers in the area, and finding them meant potential salvation for the combined fleet. The Americans had achieved surprise, but Japanese naval aviation remained the most experienced in the world. One successful attack could still salvage victory from disaster. Historical records from the Naval War College's analysis of the Battle of Midway indicate that Admiral Yamaguchi's decision to launch an immediate counterattack represented Japanese naval doctrine at its finest: aggressive action despite overwhelming odds. Yorktown became visible on the horizon at 1400 hours, her flight deck launching fighters to intercept the incoming strike. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch led his F-4F Wildcat fighters in the Thatchweave, a defensive tactic designed to counter the Zero's superior maneuverability. The aerial battle that followed showcased the deadly evolution of carrier warfare, as American and Japanese pilots engaged in combat 3 miles above the Pacific. Kobayashi's dive bombers broke through the fighter screen through sheer determination and superior numbers. His aircraft rolled into its attack dive as anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with deadly black puffs. The 1,000-pound bomb released from his aircraft struck Yorktown's flight deck near the island, penetrating deep into the ship's vitals before exploding among the radar and communications equipment. 2 more bombs followed in quick succession, their explosions shaking the carrier like a giant's fist. Yorktown's speed dropped to 6 knots as damage control parties fought fires and flooding throughout her hull. The ship that had survived the Coral Sea engagement now faced possible destruction. In the Central Pacific, her crew working frantically to save their command, but Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's flagship was built to survive. Damage control teams sealed compartments and rerouted power as the carrier's escorts provided defensive fire against subsequent attacks. By 1500 hours, Yorktown was making 20 knots and recovering aircraft, her flight deck operational. Despite the damage sustained, the Japanese counterattack had achieved tactical success, but strategic failure. Yorktown remained afloat and operational, while 3 Japanese carriers burned beyond salvation. Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu prepared for a final strike, knowing his ship now faced the combined air power of 2 undamaged American carriers. The rising sun, that had seemed invincible at dawn, now faced extinction beneath the Pacific sky, its formations crumbling as American vengeance struck like lightning from clear blue heavens. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood in Hiryu's flag bridge, his face illuminated by the amber glow of the setting sun as reports flooded in from across the battlefield. 3 of his carriers lay dead in the water, Akagi abandoned and burning, Kaga listing heavily with magazine explosions still rippling through her hull, and Soryu's captain choosing death with his ship rather than abandonment. Only Hiryu remained, her flight deck scarred but operational, her aircraft ready for one final strike against the American fleet. The afternoon attack had damaged Yorktown, but intelligence suggested 2 more American carriers remained operational. Somewhere to the east, Yamaguchi faced the mathematics of naval warfare, his single carrier against 2 American flat-tops, his depleted air groups against fresh squadrons that had already proven their deadly effectiveness. Yet the Samurai Code demanded action, and Admiral Yamaguchi was the finest carrier commander in the Imperial Navy. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga prepared his second strike of the day, knowing his aircraft bore the hopes of the entire combined fleet. 13 Aichi D3 Aval dive bombers and 10 Nakajima B5 and Kate torpedo bombers represented Hiryu's remaining offensive power. Many of his pilots had flown since dawn, their aircraft bearing battle damage from earlier engagements. But Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized aggressive action regardless of odds. Meanwhile, aboard Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance studied reconnaissance reports with the methodical precision that characterized his command style. The 4th Japanese carrier had been located, and every available aircraft was being armed for immediate launch. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's dive bombers and Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's torpedo planes represented the striking power that would complete American victory if they could find their target before Hiryu launched another devastating attack. The race against time began at 1600 hours as both sides launched their remaining aircraft into the afternoon sky. Tomonaga's bombers flew east toward the American task force, while Gallagher's dauntless dive bombers flew west toward Hiryu's last known position. The carrier that could strike first would determine the battle's outcome, and both air groups carried the hopes of their respective nations. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's official Navy history, the Two-Ocean War, the afternoon phase of Midway represented pure naval aviation warfare, stripped to its essential elements: speed, surprise, and devastating firepower. Yorktown's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 1700 hours, her fighter controllers scrambling every available F-4F Wildcat to intercept. The carrier had recovered from morning damage and was launching aircraft when Tomonaga's formation appeared on the horizon like avenging spirits. Despite heavy losses to American fighters, the Japanese pilots pressed their attack with the dedication that had made them masters of the Pacific. Tomonaga himself flew the lead aircraft, his engine trailing smoke from earlier battle damage as he lined up for his torpedo run. The American carrier filled his windscreen, her anti-aircraft guns throwing up a curtain of steel that shattered aircraft, and cruised with equal efficiency. At 800 yards, he released his torpedo and pulled away, his aircraft disintegrating under defensive fire as the weapon ran straight and true toward Yorktown's starboard side. The explosion amidships stopped the carrier dead in the water, her engineering spaces flooded and her power systems failing. This time, Yorktown's damage proved mortal. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea finally succumbed to Japanese naval aviation expertise. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to the heavy cruiser Astoria as his flagship, began her final battle against the Pacific depths. But even as Yorktown died, Enterprise's dive bombers were approaching Hiryu from out of the sun. Earl Gallagher's dauntless aircraft rolled into their attack dives as the Japanese carrier turned, desperately to avoid destruction. The afternoon light glinted off American wings as 24 aircraft plunged toward their target, with the same mathematical precision that had destroyed 3 carriers that morning. The bombs fell like thunderbolts from heaven, striking Hiryu's flight deck and penetrating deep into her vitals before exploding among aircraft and ordnance. Within minutes, the last operational Japanese carrier was burning as fiercely as her sisters, her flight deck a twisted ruin that would never launch aircraft again. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain with his ship, standing on the bridge as fires consumed his command. The last samurai's stand had ended, and with it died Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. June 4th, 1942, 2100 hours. The Pacific darkness was punctuated by 4 pillars of fire that had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles northwest of the carnage, as radio reports detailed the complete destruction of his first carrier striking force. The architect of Pearl Harbor watched his carefully crafted strategy collapse in a single day. The mobile striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months now burning beneath foreign stars. Aboard the light cruiser Nagara, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo surveyed the tactical situation with the detached professionalism of a career naval officer facing impossible circumstances. Akagi had been abandoned at 1900 hours, her magazines threatening imminent explosion as fires raged beyond control. Kaga had rolled over and sunk 20 minutes later, taking 800 men to the bottom of the Pacific. Soryu followed. At 1913, Captain Yanagimoto choosing death with his ship in accordance with ancient naval tradition. Only Hiryu remained afloat, but barely. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi had refused evacuation orders, standing on his bridge as flames consumed the flight deck and hangar spaces. The carrier that had struck the final blow against Yorktown now faced her own destruction, secondary explosions rippling through her hull as aviation gasoline and ordnance cooked off in the intense heat. Commander John Waldron's sacrifice at dawn had been vindicated by sunset. Torpedo Squadron 8's destruction had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the sky clear for Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers. The mathematical precision of American naval aviation had achieved what months of Japanese victories made unthinkable: the simultaneous destruction of 4 fleet carriers in 12 hours. Naval historian Gordon Prange's research documented in Miracle at Midway reveals that Japanese damage control procedures, while excellent for battleship warfare, proved inadequate for the volatile nature of aircraft carrier operations. Under combat conditions, the human cost was staggering on both sides. Hiryu's hangar deck had become an inferno that consumed men and machines with equal efficiency. Damage control parties fought desperately to contain fires that fed on aviation gasoline and torpedo warheads, their efforts heroic but ultimately futile. The ship's structural integrity was failing as steel beams softened and temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit Captain Tomio Kaku made the final decision at 2300 hours, ordering all hands to abandon ship. As Hiryu's forward magazines threatened catastrophic explosion, Admiral Yamaguchi remained on the bridge with his flag captain, both men choosing honor over survival in accordance with the Bushido Code that governed Japanese naval officers. Their last radio transmission was a poem celebrating the cherry blossoms' brief but beautiful existence. The explosions that followed could be seen 50 miles away. Hiryu's forward magazines detonated in a pillar of fire that illuminated the Pacific darkness. Like a false dawn, the blast wave rolling across the water with the force of an earthquake. When the flames subsided, nothing remained of the carrier, except burning wreckage scattered across square miles of ocean. But the battle's strategic implications extended far beyond the tactical destruction of 4 carriers. Japan had lost not just ships, but the irreplaceable pilots who had gained experience in China and perfected their skills at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, went down with Akagi. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Jigusa, master of dive bombing tactics, perished aboard Soryu. The institutional knowledge of Japanese naval aviation was burning. On the Pacific depths, Admiral Yamamoto faced a strategic reality that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The combined fleet had suffered its first major defeat, losing for fleet carriers and their experienced air groups in a single day. American industrial capacity would replace Enterprise and Yorktown within months, but Japan's shipyards could not match such production. More critically, the pilot training programs that had produced the veterans of Pearl Harbor required years to develop equivalent expertise. As midnight approached on June 4, 1942, the rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy. The formations that had dominated the Pacific were crumbling beneath American determination and industrial might. Their sacred waters now witnessed to an inferno that marked the beginning of Japan's long defeat. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the preliminary battle reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters as the Hawaiian dawn broke over waters. Still scarred by the December attack, the intelligence seemed impossible for Japanese fleet carriers destroyed. The cream of Imperial Navy aviation eliminated in 12 hours of combat. Yet the radio transmissions from Admiral Spruance's task force confirmed the unthinkable. American naval aviation had achieved the most decisive victory in the history of carrier warfare. The strategic implications rippled across the Pacific like shock waves from a seismic event. Japan's southward expansion toward Australia had been halted. Her plans for Operation FS against Fiji and Samoa now impossible without carrier support. The Doolittle raid's psychological impact was multiplied tenfold by Midway's tactical devastation. American forces had proven capable of defeating the Imperial Navy's finest units in conventional battle. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers had changed the course of World War II. In 5 minutes of combat, the mathematical precision of his attack had exploited the fundamental vulnerability of aircraft carriers' flight decks crowded with armed aircraft and aviation gasoline created floating bombs that could be detonated by single bomb hits. Japanese damage control, excellent for battleship warfare, proved inadequate for carrier operations under combat conditions. Admiral Raymond Spruance consolidated his tactical victory. With characteristic methodical precision, Enterprise and Hornet recovered their aircraft as search planes scoured the Pacific for survivors and additional enemy units. The loss of Yorktown was painful, but acceptable given the strategic gains 3 American carriers had eliminated for Japanese flat-tops and their irreplaceable air groups. The human stories emerging from the battle revealed both heroism and tragedy on an epic scale. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued after 30 hours floating in his life jacket. While watching the destruction of the Japanese fleet, his squadron mate's sacrifice had enabled McCluskey's successful dive bomber attack, their deaths saving thousands of American lives in future battles. According to declassified U.S. Navy battle reports archived at the Naval Historical Center, American losses totaled 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 147 aircraft compared to Japanese losses of 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and 248 aircraft. Captain Buckmaster's damage control teams aboard Yorktown had demonstrated American naval engineering at its finest. Despite taking multiple bomb and torpedo hits, the carrier remained afloat for 2 days. After the battle, her crew fighting desperately to save their ship, only the intervention of Japanese submarine I-168 finally sent the damaged flattop to the bottom, her colors still flying as she slipped beneath the Pacific swells. The industrial implications of Midway would prove as decisive as the tactical victory. American shipyards were already laying down keels for Essex-class carriers that would outnumber Japanese construction by ratios exceeding 10 to 1. The pilot training programs that had produced men like McCluskey and Thatch were expanding exponentially. While Japan's veteran aviators lay dead on the Pacific floor, Admiral Yamamoto's strategic position had become untenable. The combined fleet still possessed overwhelming battleship superiority, but carrier aviation now dominated naval warfare without air cover. His magnificent super battleships were vulnerable targets for American submarine and air attack. The initiative that Japan had seized at Pearl Harbor was passing permanently to American forces. Emperor Hirohito received news of the defeat in his palace as cherry blossoms fell in the imperial gardens. The divine wind that had protected Japan from foreign invasion for 7 centuries had failed against American determination and industrial might. The formations that had carried the rising sun across the Pacific were crumbling beneath sustained assault from a nation that would not accept defeat. The eagles were rising in the east, their wings spanning an ocean that would soon become an American lake. Midway had proven that Japanese naval supremacy was an illusion built on tactical surprise rather than strategic superiority. When that surprise was lost, the mathematical realities of industrial warfare reasserted themselves with devastating finality. The tide of war was turning, and it would never turn back. Emperor Hirohito walked through the palace gardens where cherry blossoms had fallen like snow, their brief beauty now scattered across ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of Japanese triumph and disaster. The morning reports from Admiral Yamamoto confirmed what the emperor had suspected. Since news of Midway first reached Tokyo, the divine wind that had protected Japan, since the Mongol invasions had failed against American industrial might and tactical innovation, the strategic ramifications extended far beyond the loss of 4 carriers. Japan's naval aviation had been built around veteran pilots who required years of training to achieve proficiency in carrier operations. Lieutenant Commanders Itaya, Igusa, and Fukuda, the men who had made Pearl Harbor possible, were either dead or permanently disabled. Their institutional knowledge could not be replaced by the accelerated training programs that wartime necessity demanded. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo studied intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of American industrial capacity. The Essex-class carrier construction program would produce 24 fleet carriers by 1945, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace the vessels lost at Midway. More critically, American pilot training was expanding exponentially while Japan's aviation schools faced insurmountable shortages of fuel, aircraft, and experienced instructors. The mathematical certainties of prolonged warfare had reasserted themselves with devastating clarity. Admiral Yamamoto's strategy had depended on decisive battle that would force American acceptance of Japanese conquests in the Pacific. Instead, Midway had demonstrated that American forces could match Japanese tactical excellence while possessing overwhelming strategic advantages in production and resources. General Douglas MacArthur's forces in Australia now faced reduced Japanese pressure as carrier aircraft were diverted to defensive operations around the home islands. The planned invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled indefinitely, allowing Allied forces to strengthen their positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. Admiral Ernest King's strategic vision of carrier-based offensive operations had been validated by McCluskey's dive bombers over the Kido Butai. Historical analysis by the Japanese Defense Agency's official war history concluded that Midway represented the decisive turning point, where American industrial superiority began to overwhelm Japanese tactical advantages. accumulated through years of combat experience. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the material losses. Japanese naval officers, who had considered their forces invincible since Pearl Harbor, now faced the reality of catastrophic defeat, inflicted by American pilots flying obsolescent aircraft. The myth of Japanese naval supremacy had been shattered by 5 minutes of precision bombing that exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in carrier design and damage control procedures. Admiral Chester Nimitz's strategic patience had been vindicated by the most complete naval victory in American history. His decision to position Task Forces 16 and 17 northeast of Midway had created the tactical conditions for decisive engagement, while cryptographic intelligence had eliminated Japanese advantages in surprise and concentration. The ambush that Japan had planned for American forces had been reversed through superior intelligence and operational planning. The formations that had carried the rising sun from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean were permanently broken. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu lay on the Pacific floor along with their experienced air groups, while American carriers prepared for offensive operations that would carry the stars and stripes across 10,000 miles of ocean to Tokyo Bay itself. Emperor Hirohito understood that his empire faced defeat unless dramatic changes in strategy could reverse the tide that had turned at Midway. But the industrial realities that Admiral Yamamoto had hoped to circumvent through decisive battle were now asserting themselves with mathematical inevitability. American production capacity, freed from the constraints of fighting a two-ocean war by Japanese tactical defeat, would soon overwhelm any defensive measures the empire could devise. The cherry blossoms had fallen, and winter was coming for the land of the rising sun. The formations that had seemed invincible at dawn on December 7, 1941, had crumbled beneath Midway's overwhelming assault, their sacred mission transformed into funeral. Pyres on foreign waters dot the eagles had learned to fly, and their wings now darkened the Pacific sky from Midway to the Marshall Islands, harbingers of liberation for enslaved peoples and justice for the victims of Pearl Harbor. The tide that had swept Japanese forces across the Pacific was now flowing inexorably toward Tokyo, carrying with it the promise of ultimate American victory and the restoration of peace to the war-torn world.